Since Starfield released, I have been varying degrees of engulfed in it, and yes, though the title alludes to a critical discussion today of sorts, I still very much so like this game. But there was one issue I wanted to talk about in an isolated sense, because it's something that really stood out to me, especially as I got, a few dozen hours in, and has been pretty consistently present since. I think it's perhaps Starfield's greatest flaw because it hinges on the game's main selling point, and that selling point is of course the prospect of space exploration. This is not a department where I feel Starfield fares too terribly in, but there are some limitations that hold it back immensely from where it could have been and what this game could have accomplished. But besides that, there's still a lovable, competent Bethesda Game Studios RPG under the surface that is complete with all the standard features.
Catastrophic damage.
There's a lot to like, and I intend this video to be constructive, not destructive. And in my experience, there are people who watch YouTube content like this who can't really tell the difference. It's the vocal minority, but it's a minority all the same. So what is Starfield's greatest flaw? What is its setback? What is the thing that really keeps Starfield from being an absolute 10 out of 10 if number ratings actually held any value outside of dismissing any critical comments that might have been made? And that is, the concept of space exploration in a video game is notoriously incredibly difficult to get absolutely right, and Starfield is no exception to this rule. Space is massively vast, and you need to sell that point. At the same time, you need to produce content for it to keep it entertaining. And on top of that, space exploration in games is an illusion because the game was still made by people in a basement somewhere, but the main battle is the competition between scale and ambition and what's technologically possible, at least while we're still breathing. And it's juggling these conflicts where Starfield sort of shoots itself in the foot. Or at least the tone, not that I'm entirely sure which would hurt more, but I'm sure somebody would be willing to tell me, just please don't show me. Now this issue is multi-layered and encompasses a lot of the elements of this game's exploration. I do acknowledge that. In fact, I'm gonna need to, because I will talk about these things individually. It's easier than trying to clump it all together. So the first aspect I'd like to discuss are the technical limitations. Now these will be relatively overarching, but for the time being, I reckon it's an easy place to begin. For better or worse, Starfield is a clusterfuck of loading screens. It's hardly the most out of left field thing to come from a Bethesda RPG. To travel to a new star system, you'll probably be met with a loading screen. You'll probably also be met with a loading screen if you attempt to land on a planet. The same can be said for exiting or re-entering your ship, and plenty of interiors as well. On top of that, the game relies heavily on fast travel, or something that has a very similar effect to fast travel. And if you don't use menu-based navigation, you're not going to go anywhere. Because every time you're actually flying your ship and in control, you're not actually moving very far if at all. Because everything you see is actually a skybox, and whilst you can get closer if you have hours of free time and nothing better to do, which I guarantee you have, utilising the menu is just the only practical option. And you'll need to anyway regardless. The purpose of spaceflight is to experience other priorities such as space combat, interacting with other vessels, and just otherwise having a portable hub area. One that you can customise to be as mangled or as fancy as you like. So it's not an unforgivable crime that the space travel itself is incredibly limited when there is value to be had from it regardless. There are thoughtful mechanics in play, it's just somewhat glaring when the setbacks create a feeling that's in contrast to what the game's supposed to be about. And I think there's no way of avoiding that, at least when you're flying around in space, because space is unbelievably huge. There is so much, space between one place and another. When a game is about exploration in space, you really don't want to be cheapening the sense of scale. But when you're flying the ship, you're not actually meaningfully going anywhere very often, and that's probably most obvious because you're limited to flying the ship in space. You cannot fly the ship when you're in a planet's atmosphere, which to me feels like a massive missed opportunity. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure somebody will eventually mod it in if they haven't already. And the reason you can't is probably because of more technical limitations that you're hit with when you've landed on a planet. So you can land anywhere on a planet and be met for the most part with procedural generation, which gives you all sorts of places to go and check out. Not that after a while they will offer very much of value, which is a talking point for later on. But there are limitations on how far you can stray from your ship before you have to go back to your ship, go back to space, and then choose somewhere else on that world to land on, and rinse repeat. And I appreciate that without these limitations in place, the creation engine would likely shit itself. But can you imagine how much more engaging the flight mechanics would actually be if there was some agency over movement provided by flying in the proverbial clouds of a world and choosing where to land with gameplay? Not only that, but dogfights would be much more challenging and there'd be more diversity in that mechanic because obstacles will no longer be limited to asteroids and the occasional space station, which as it stands is the only reprieve from the feeling of not actually going anywhere when manually flying. But if you think the limitations end when you ditch your vessel for exploring the land, you'd be mistaken. For a game boasting as much size as Starfield, procedural generation is entirely unavoidable. There are plenty of places that have clearly been designed and specifically crafted, and a lot of the stories take place there, and those will also be the easiest places to pick up meaningful quests. But unless you're directed to these locations by a quest you've picked up elsewhere, the chances are everywhere else you'll find will 99 times out of 100 be largely procedurally generated. And the problem with procedural generation isn't that it's used, it can be a miracle worker. It's more so that when it's not used in moderation, it does become incredibly obvious. So how it works is if you choose to land at a random, non-specified part of a planet or moon, based on the information the game has allocated to that world, the procedural generation takes over in generating the landscape, the allocation of resources on that world, and points of interest for you to discover. And then there are other variables depending on the world, such as life and etc. But naturally, when you're exploring these regions, you'll be gravitated towards points of interest that can take a fair few forms, and they quite reliably spawn no matter where you go. And that's not necessarily always ideal and can come across sometimes a little bit thoughtless, because there are only so many presets of what locations can realistically spawn, so you may find a facility on one world that is identical to another facility from 10 hours ago across the galaxy. Rock formations and other natural stuff, that can be as repetitive as you like. But Starfield generates an awful lot of nameless facilities wherever you go, and those locations can be abandoned or they might not be. Often there are nameless people there, but it's an utter coin toss as to whether or not those people are hostile or friendly. Usually they're hostile. After not very long of doing this, you start to realise how little value these places actually have. Typically it's a straightforward firefight where you waste bullets for a gun the ammo to which just doesn't spawn ever, for no reason other than to ordinarily complete a procedurally generated quest that is usually relatively straightforward and boils down to killing and fetching, sometimes both, and every so often in broken English. For example, the best character in the game, Arc Might Worker, gave me this objective: kill and gather meat at cave. This is what happens when a nameless character in a nameless settlement sends you off to a nameless location to kill a nameless animal, or at least a random animal, because the game is yet to decide which animal will spawn at cave, and gather nameless meat. So all there is to do is go to cave and kill and loot every biological abomination the game has decided to shit out inside until you get a new objective. Return the meat back to Arc Might Worker. Why is it formatted like that's the character's actual name? Now, procedural generation is the only reason why Starfield is anywhere near as big as it is, but it is heavily limited in what it can actually generate, and it's worth remembering the vast majority of those features need to be actively developed by attentive people. Give it too much leeway, the system doesn't know what to do with it, and as a result everything that isn't specifically designed becomes incredibly generic. There are plenty of first experiences to be had out on random planets in Starfield, but there's no real reason to stick around for a second. And considering how much of the game's surface area, shall we say, is randomised, that well does dry up rather quickly. The positive is no matter where you go in the Starfield universe, shall we say, everywhere has content. And the negative is no matter where you go in the Starfield universe, everywhere has content. You'll always find something to see and something to do, but whether that thing is more interesting than doing the dishes is another question. And sometimes places will be better off without anything really going for it whatsoever. The best way to sell the scale of space is to have some worlds that are completely barren and uninhabited, and not only that, they have nothing indicating human presence on them. In Starfield, no matter which world you go to or which moon you go to, you're always going to find some form of human-made structure somewhere. This implies that people have been everywhere that you can go in the game. And the effect of that is you're not actually exploring very much, are you? They've sacrificed seamless traversal for scale, and yet the vast emptiness of the universe is not something that you can actively feel very often. So not only is the procedural generation glaringly obvious after a short bit of exploring, but it's also highly claustrophobic, and there's no real way to avoid it. In that sense, Starfield falls victim to its own concept. The saving grace is there are plenty of places in Starfield that are thoughtfully designed, for example Neon, New Atlantis and Aquila City, and plenty of other places out in the Starfield that you have to actively seek out. Not to mention the snowball effect of discovering new places of this caliber from places that you've already been to based on the quests you pick up there. But if you go out on your own and attempt to discover those places spontaneously, you realise just how inefficient this world design actually is, especially when compared to other Bethesda Game Studios franchises such as Fallout or The Elder Scrolls. Because in those games there are still plenty of places that aren't awfully interesting. And there are also plenty of places that are not dissimilar to Starfield in that sense, but what does change is the distance between them. In Starfield, if one location on a random planet isn't interesting, the nearest one's probably about 500 meters to 1,000 meters away, and then you have to run to it across a vast landscape of not an awful lot with no alternative mode of transport. But in the Elder Scrolls, or Fallout, an interesting thing could be just down the road, or just round a corner, nearby enough that your attention span isn't strained. And that is an impossible feat for a game as ambitious as Starfield, with around 1,000 planets and moons for us to land on. And though Fallout, The Elder Scrolls and Starfield have an awful lot in common, Starfield is all about space exploration. So is it really fair to hold it to the standards of a much more confined, smaller, open world space that doesn't incorporate actual space with a more precise, concise and navigable design? It really depends on how you look at it. If you think that Starfield accomplishes an immersive exploration experience, then absolutely not, it's a different game. But if you believe that Starfield's exploration aspects actively defeat their own point, then the effect you're left with is an RPG not dissimilar to those other games, therefore exploration aspects that don't land properly and yet still somehow require there to be almost 1,000 procedurally generated planets at least, will arguably come across as bloat. Fortunately, I went in for the Bethesda RPG. I wasn't awfully interested in the notion of exploring every world this game has to offer. I find the world building and lore in Starfield to be interesting enough. I found the main narrative to suffer from similar pitfalls to previous titles, but it was passable to justify existing in the game. So I'm largely satisfied with Starfield with regards to what I was personally after. But I think I became very aware of the fact that there certainly was an inherent flaw with how the game sets up its exploration, when ironically the most interesting planet that I found in the entire game was Earth. As different as it is to the Earth we know, that within itself is interesting. Then there are unique landmarks, and whilst they're there simply as Easter eggs and references for the most part, again, it's memorable. Even if Earth's state is an excuse to avoid having to do too much with it to make it believable, it's interesting because the environment still tells a story. And though the only reason is it's a place you expect to be something of an anchor point and it just isn't that in this game, that within itself is a unique feeling that no other planet or moon in this game can have. But none of that nonsense I've just spouted over the past 15 minutes is to say that there's nothing to be had from this game's exploration, because that also isn't true. For example, I will never grow tired of pondering the horizon on the moon of a gas giant. I cannot tell you why, but it genuinely brings me pleasure beyond belief. Ignore the technical limitations and the fact that you're surrounded by 6 abandoned factories. The sight of a gas giant on the horizon, even in a game, is just genuinely awesome. Besides that, there are plenty of actual quests that might take you out into the sticks. It might not be an exploration value, but at least these worlds aren't entirely pointless all the time. I just find that technologically in this game, the vast majority of worlds you can land on are very limited. They're both simultaneously sparse and breathing down your neck. Traversal is limited, and so are the opportunities. In other words, the vast majority of the good stuff in Starfield can be found in rather specific places, excluding loot and random gunfights for the sake of it at least. And that is dwarfed by an awful lot of not a lot. And that also happens to be not enough of enough, and not enough of not enough. It made sense in my head, okay? But let's get off of this talking point before you get tired of it and I get tired of pretending to be intelligent, I guess. The technical limitations of the exploration as it's presented in Starfield are apparent on all levels. Loading screens galore alone is not necessarily the end of the world, but that combined with not really being able to go very far with the ship without having to use a menu of some description, the fact that limits carry over onto most worlds, and the endless onslaught of procedurally generated abandoned factories do reduce the impact of the immersive feeling of exploration. But the technical aspect isn't the only limitation in Starfield's design. It also translates into other demonstrations of scale. For example, New Atlantis on Jemison is supposed to be the heart of the United Colonies, the heart of human civilization in the stars. The problem is, it's a planet with one city, the occasional civilian outpost and research outpost here and there, and the rest of the world is procedurally generated. The city of New Atlantis is small, and it leaves you wondering where everybody else is. I think it would have been far more beneficial to not have these planets be as openly explorable as they are. Instead, it would have made sense for the areas we can visit in New Atlantis to remain the same but be closed off, and as far as the eye can see outside this area are buildings and other things that you can't go to, things that allow your imagination to fill in the blanks as to where the vast majority of humanity is. You're at the heart of humanity. There's nothing necessarily for you to discover there that hasn't already been discovered by somebody somewhere. So there's no real exploration value, you just can because. Instead, I feel as if it should have been giving you an idea for the more civilized frontiers of space, which gives you that sense that life is all around you, even further than you can go. And I'm not just talking about these weird flowered mantis creatures. I'm talking about playing into a player's imagination to give them the feeling that they actually are somewhere, to function as a contrast to when you're in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Because that not only focuses things by cutting out some unnecessary bloat, but if you get fed up with being nowhere, there's somewhere you can go to feel like you aren't nowhere anymore. I use Mass Effect as an example when talking about this a lot. The Citadel isn't widely explorable, but it feels like the heart of the galaxy because it leaves so much up to your imagination. When here you're compressed to relatively small districts, but it's packed with culture, tone and lore that makes it immersive. And 99.9% of it you can't explore because you can't go to those places. As a result, your imagination fills in the blanks where they crop up, and you get a sense of scale. What you can experience is only a fraction of what's conceptually there. And that contrasts the more lifeless worlds you can visit, even if on those worlds they aren't necessarily amazing demonstrations of open world game design. There is a very well distinguished difference between one type of location and another. Once you've experienced the entirety of what's available in New Atlantis, you've experienced the entirety of New Atlantis. And the same can be said for Aquila City, though I actually quite like Aquila City. These are the hubs of the United Colonies and Freestar Collective respectively, and neither really feel like that. And it's all because that way you can go off and explore a generic cave in the distance. The exception to this rule is Neon. Because it's on a water world with no real land, you can only land at the city and you can only explore the city. As a result, it's more enclosed, compact and dense. And it arguably has the most palpable atmosphere of all the cities in the game. This is not a coincidence, because you could believe this place to be much larger than the area you're allowed to explore. Whether or not the effect is intentional, I couldn't say, but it's appreciated just the same. There is more room for imagination here, and as a result it's a bit more believable and engaging. I'm not trying to say that the explorable areas of New Atlantis or even Aquila City need to be bigger, they're the right size for what you need them to be. But I don't see the value in exploring those planets outside of the cities, because surely those planets are largely conquered, therefore there's nothing really to gain from exploring much of them. And that point is proven by the fact that you can, and all it does is blur the lines between being in the heart of civilization and the middle of absolutely nowhere on a barren world. The end result is the looming question of what can you really get by being here that you can't get here? And I suppose vice versa. The exploration where it counts is blurred with where it isn't as effective, because it's applied indiscriminately and without focus, cheapening the sense of scale, because everywhere, no matter how visually diverse, after a while begins to feel like the exact same place, a feeling reinforced by copy-pasted procedurally generated locations, relegating many worlds' significance to the resources that you may or may not find on them, and as a result nowhere really stands out as incredibly unique. That's not to say there aren't really cool discoveries to be made out in Starfield, but your chances of randomly happening upon them are incredibly low, and the game will find ways to guide you to them. But that doesn't take away from the fact that some of the discoveries are pretty neat. But it's hard to call it exploration when you know exactly where you're going when you're going there. Due to the fact that you can land virtually anywhere on any world, it's highly unlikely that you'll stumble upon a genuine point of interest. And by that I mean not procedurally generated, without some form of quest marker leading you to the actual thing. And again, because of the size of the worlds that you're visiting and the space between one place and another, the chances of you getting distracted whilst carrying out a mission objective are again going to be fairly low. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that some of the best experiences I've had in the Elder Scrolls and Fallout titles stem from when you get distracted when carrying out some other task. You're travelling between one point and another, and you see somewhere that you want to investigate. You go, you find something interesting, and you feel rewarded for it. Maybe not necessarily with a material gain in the game universe, but with the experience itself. And because of the much smaller scale of those games, encountering them naturally is much more probable. Because of the scope of Starfield, most things will be encountered in much more specific ways. It's not always a bad thing, but sometimes it's nice to be surprised. But sometimes the absence of distractions makes it feel as if there isn't so much to actually find. So for the majority of the time, the exploration, in my experience, has been limited to where the quests have taken me. But when I just decide to jump to a random system and see what's about and I happen upon a quest, I am quite happy about that. In failing that, interactions don't go amiss, and there are a few of those.
Do you know the way to Uranus? Let me help you out. It's right behind you! Smell you later!
So let's bring this to a conclusion before I truly lose my mind. I find Starfield to be a good Bethesda RPG. My opinion on that hasn't changed since I released this video, but in my opinion its weakest area is the exploration. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who feel similar ways. And I'm also sure there will be plenty of people who don't necessarily feel those things, and that's cool. For me, it wasn't an area that disappointed me because I never went into Starfield expecting groundbreaking exploration. I think from the moment I heard that there would be like 1,000 planets in this game, I knew where to place my expectations, and that was vindicated. But considering how important exploration appeared to be in the marketing, it's fair to critique how the game actually handles it. If you go into Starfield expecting the best space exploration game going, I don't necessarily think it accomplishes that. But if you go in expecting your bog standard Bethesda Game Studios RPG, there's plenty of things for Starfield to boast about, but the exploration is just not one of them. It's not unpassable, but the technical limitations are profound, and the procedural generation is incredibly repetitive, not to mention a little bit erratically indiscriminate to the point where randomly happening upon something unique doesn't feel like it occurs as often as it should, and the content can sometimes feel simultaneously absent and abundant. It's also an area that could have benefited massively from being a bit more streamlined perhaps. Maybe not have entire planets be explorable, but rather select areas. That way you know there's at least going to be some meaningful content, and the game certainly could have done with more dynamics with regards to traversal both on land and when flying your spaceship. Access to a land vehicle would have saved an awful lot of time and pain, and not being able to manually fly within a planet's atmosphere also wouldn't have gone amiss. Regardless of this issue though, I still recommend Starfield to any like-minded thinkers who are debating it still. I feel the game has an awful lot to offer besides. It even had a stint of controversy on release when it became the latest chapter of the anti-woke versus woke headbutting convention. Not that I necessarily fully understand why, nor do I care. Anyway, thank you for watching this utter ramble of a video. I thought it was worthy of a discussion, and you can get involved with said discussion using the comments section, but I do hope that everybody can at least keep it somewhat respectful down there, and hopefully I've chatted enough nonsense to the point where you understand where I'm coming from with this point, but if you don't, that's perfectly fine, I guess. But be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff if you want to. If you don't, because there'd be no point. But look, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care and goodbye.